Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk a little bit about militaries, so how they're structured, and then continue a little bit on to weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons. Next time we'll continue on the military theme, looking at kind of the use of force from a power perspective. So how can you exert power using your military? All right, so what are the types of military force? So we can broadly separate it into three: conventional forces, irregular forces, which would be guerrilla forces or terrorists, or weapons of mass destruction. So conventional forces kind of think of as um, what standard military operations. So if the military uses Army, Navy, Air Force, something like that, to conduct any form of military conflict or any military purpose, that's usually conventional forces. When we're talking irregular forces, either guerrilla or terrorists, usually then we're talking about non-state actors, so not states themselves, but groups that are either kind of fighting a civil war against a state, or are engaged in some form of insurgency even against a different state. But here we're not talking about usually about government forces, but non-government forces. And then weapons of mass destruction could be deployed by either government forces or non-government forces, although in general, weapons of mass destruction have largely been restricted to the ranks of government, so we'll talk a little bit about those. So today we're going to focus mostly on conventional forces and weapons of mass destruction. We'll return a little bit to irregular forces when we talk about civil wars. So what are conventional weapons, or what are conventional weapons used for? So the most fundamental purpose of conventional forces is to take, hold, or defend territory, right? So here we're talking about your classic military. So think about war, right? Purposes of war could be to take new territory, um, hold, say, newly acquired territory. So say you've acquired new territory and you don't want to lose it to a counterattack, or defend territory, right? Arguably the primary mission of most militaries most of the time is to make sure that the homeland remains secure, that there's sovereign control over the territory. Without a strong enough defense, then you're vulnerable to attack. So most of the time, most armies aren't trying to take territory or aren't trying to hold newly acquired territory. Most purposes for the military then typically fall under defend territory, at least most of the time. Branches of the military, so there's some difference across countries, but typically speaking, militaries are divided up into armies, navies, and air forces. Armies and navies being quite old, air forces being newer additions in the 20th century to the militaries. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of what armies, navies, and air forces are, what they do. So the Army is the backbone of the military, right? So navies and air forces are very important, but in most militaries, the Army is the backbone. So largest in size and largest mission. Sorry. Army's, part of its usefulness is that it's effective at controlling territory. So again, thinking of the missions in terms of taking, holding, and defending territory, all of them are based on controlling the territory. And the Army is very useful there. Air Force, Navy can play strong roles, say, in terms of many of those different missions, but at the end of the day, you always, no matter how much of the mission's done by Navy, and the Navy and Air Force, at the end of the day, you still need to have boots on the ground in pretty much any type of mission, whether it's taking, holding, or defending territory. And that's the Army's role. Usually armies are subdivided into infantry, so individual soldiers, boots on the ground, artillery, so long range, guns that could shoot projectiles long range, usually in support of infantry, and then armor or cavalry, so tanks, stuff like that. So got a few pictures for different things, different ones. So as much as possible, I tried to get pictures of the Canadian forces. So here's a picture of infantry, right? So probably arguably the backbone of the army would be the infantry, right? So individual riflemen or riflewomen who you know, operate in squads or larger to take hold or defend territory. Can be supported from distance. So if they get into trouble, if there's either in terms of before, say, entering somewhere, if you want to soften the target, artillery in the bottom right can come into play in terms of launching from a long distance projectiles, or if infantry comes into heavy contact with enemy forces and needs support, artillery can provide support from a distance. And then here we have armor. So we could think of it in terms of kind of your traditional in the top left, your traditional battle tank. This is kind of the successor to the cavalry. So you know, knights on horseback. This is the modern version. You know, being tanks with large guns, a lot of armor on them. So strong support to infantry, able to do, you know, go a lot of places that are more contentious, that are a little bit more dangerous thanks to their armor. And then in the bottom right, we've got an armored personnel carrier. So some offensive capability in terms of weaponry, in terms of large guns, but primary purpose is to be able to transport infantry over wider territory. So rather than having infantry have to walk, an APC gives them kind of protection, gives them armor while they're being displaced and moved to other places on the battlefield. When we think about kind of the ability of a military to not defend territory as much, but to take and hold territory, one useful concept is Kenneth Boulding's loss of strength gradient. So essentially, it puts out the argument that that the power of a state, the ability of a state to project power given a certain amount of resources, declines as a function of distance from home, right? So on the, hang on, let's get out the spotlight. So here on the power extraction and projection, so the amount that you can say get out, or the amount of power you can bring into a particular conflict, decays over distance. Along here we have distance. So the further you are from home, the less power you're able to project with a certain amount of resources. So resources that can be applied to a conflict that can be decay at distance, right? So any given amount of resources you need more of them further away. And so why is that? Well, think about if you're fighting inside your territory or just outside of your territory. So what do armies need? They need resources in terms of, you know, munitions, equipment. They need logistical support to be able to provide all of that. They need food, medical equipment. They need resupply in terms of reinforcement in terms of troops. So if you're fighting within your own territory, or if you're fighting in an adjacent territory, it's very easy to provide typically those resources, assuming you have those resources, right? Like you don't have to cross any enemy territory to be able to bring the resources. You're not traveling at a great distance to provide the resource. You don't need any special equipment to be able to support the troops. Now think about if you have troops who are fighting across the world, right? Now you have to cross great distances. Being able to provide the logistics is much more complicated. You need things like either transport the resources by sea, which is much slower, so the logistics is much more difficult, or you could do airlift, so using large planes to transport, but many countries don't have these planes. They're expensive. They're potentially vulnerable to being shot down or attacked en route. And so it's much more difficult. Many states don't have these abilities, right? So the ability to be able to prepare and execute military conflict further from home is much more expensive. Any level of resources is going to not get you as far. Now, here, if you look at the lines, we've got wealthy advanced states and poor states, right? And there's always a decline for wealthy and advanced states and for poor states, but there's less of a decline for wealthy and advanced states. And here we see there's a shift in the gradient due to technology or development, right? So countries, for example, think about before we had large planes that could transport equipment. How much more difficult it would have been to project power when you could only rely on sea power to support, which is much slower. Think about the change that happened in terms of the ability to quickly get resources and troops into a new theater of battle when you had strategic airlift, when you had advanced computers to be able to help with logistics planning. All of these, or if you have military systems that could fire over great distances, so you don't even have to support troops, you don't even have to be on site. There's a tremendous difference. So wealthy and advanced states are usually able to get the more advanced technology, the more advanced systems, which give them greater capability to not lose as much resources as the distance from home goes further. Where with poorer states, many of these advanced weapon systems or advanced logistical systems aren't things that many of those countries are able to afford to include in their military planning, which means that for many poorer states, the ability to project power any distance really from home is minimal to none. So if you think of many of the smaller countries in the world, they could fight a neighbor. They could possibly fight a neighbor's neighbor, but anything out of the region, they just have no capacity to really be able to deploy troops to that new theater of battle, and more importantly, support them there. So really, it becomes prohibitively expensive. It's not something that military is able to do without potentially some help from a great power. So if they're fighting in a coalition with a great power, and the great power is able to support them logistically or transport, then sure, they could contribute the troops and they get picked up by the great power. But in terms of fighting alone, this is something that smaller powers would not be able to do. And even many of the great powers there'd be differences depending on your great power. So the US would have by far the strongest capacity for power projection. We'll take a look somewhat at part of how soon. And then many other states, even great powers, say would be somewhere in between, say, your wealthy advanced, your US, and then your poorer states. So Navy, what's the purpose of the Navy? So first, control sea lanes, land attack, and transport. So control sea lanes. So still today, the majority of shipping that occurs and of moving goods around the world is done through shipping, right? Too expensive often to be able to move everything by air. So still most products that go internationally get sent by boats. So one of the primary purposes still for navies around the world is to control sea lanes, make sure that we have open sea lanes for commerce to be able to take place safely. Land attack, certain naval ships are built with weapon systems where they can fire on land targets, particularly ones that are closer to the sea or closer to the water. Some of the more advanced navies would have ones that could fire quite far distances inland. So being able to support, say, either soften targets for the Army, or to provide support to the Army once the Army is already on the ground. Some naval ships are able to do that. So think again of like the D-Day landings in Normandy before troops landed on ground. There was a naval bombardment of the coast to try to soften the defenses, right? So that was part of the purpose of the Navy there. Then transport. So certainly some states and some troops will be transported by air if it needs to be going over a great distance. But when troops need to be sent to a different area in the world, still many countries have had to rely on the Navy for moving them around. So as some kind of army would sometimes joke, Navy is their taxi. Navies include surface ships, aircraft carriers. So surface ships including like things like aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, frigates, transport ships, etc. We won't talk about too many of those. I mean, transport ships, it's kind of obvious what they do in terms of transporting troops, but also equipment, resources around the world. And we'll talk a little bit about aircraft carriers after. And then submarines. So ships that operate under the water, so not on the surface. So we talked about one of the primary purposes is in terms of controlling sea lanes. So here we've got a map of piracy around the world. So maritime piracy and armed robbery. So there were 6,249 reported incidents between 1995 and 2013 of piracy around the world. So while many of our movies on pirates, or stories about pirates go back centuries, piracy continues to be a problem, if anything, a growing problem in many parts of the world. So if anything, the circles are showing here that the threat, if anything, has been growing in most areas of the world. Yellow circles being kind of the situation in 1995 to 2005, and the red right, from 1995 to 2013. So we see that there's continued growth in that period. In certain areas of the world, there's been actually a lot more in the later stages. And we see that particularly in the Western Indian Ocean, where there's been, if you look in the last 10 years, there's been from the 1995 to 2013, from the 2005 to 2013 kind of portion, so the just red extension, there's been a large growth. So in all kind of major sea areas of the world, so kind of in your Panama Canal, Caribbean type area, West Africa, we have the stable problems. Smaller in the, say, Mediterranean and North Atlantic regions, piracy is not as big of a problem, but sizable problems, particularly Western Indian Ocean, the one that gets, Captain Phillips type story that gets the most publicity. So off the eastern coast of Africa, that's had the largest growth, but still the largest number of incidents in piracy overall would be in Southeast Asia. So part of the role for militaries is to protect sea lanes near your waters or where your country's ships are going to be going against piracy. So oftentimes it'd be defending kind of the waters near your home, but also, for example, in the Western Indian Ocean, many Western countries contributed, including Canada, contributed ships to defending the sea lanes there because there was too much of a problem. The problem was growing too rapidly. Too many ships were being seized, and the countries in the region didn't have the capacity to be patrolling the sea lanes. So other countries sent kind of a coalition of ships to defend the sea lanes in the region. So this is certainly still an important portion of naval activity. This is an American carrier strike group. So a aircraft carrier with its supporting ships or its defending ships. So usually we'll look at kind of the composition. So in terms of when I talked about US advantage in terms of loss of strength gradient, where it has an advantage over other countries. Part of that's in terms of many different factors, but one of the largest factors in the US's ability to project strength is in terms of the carrier strike group, just the amount of power that one of these groups can project just by itself is immense, and can be deployed to anywhere in the world. And in fact, the US has enough of them that there's often, in many areas where conflict may arise, there's already one within the region. So in terms of being able to project power, you've already got essentially a floating base in the region from which to conduct military activity. So what's included in there? So we've got about an American carrier strike group includes about 7,500 personnel, one aircraft carrier, at least one missile cruiser, at least 2 frigates or destroyers. So cruisers, destroyers, and frigates being kind of your surface ships. So ones that would be doing kind of could be doing land attack, can be doing fighting other ships, many different purposes. A carrier air wing, so the aircraft carrier itself, is carrying about 65 to 70 aircraft, including some transport, so helicopters, but reconnaissance, but also importantly, fighters and bombers, or fighter bombers often. So to be able to be doing, we'll look at many of the purposes of aircraft later, and many of them, so in terms of being able to, are supported by the aircraft carrier. So in terms of being able to do just many missions, you've got here Navy and Air Force almost in one. Oftentimes there's, it's not unusual to have kind of, in the US context, kind of a Marine carrier ship with it as well. So to have a contingent of Marines along as well, for even be able to deploy land troops. It may include submarines as well. So where, why I say US is just cut above other countries in terms of power projection. Well, if aircraft carriers are one of the strongest tools in terms of power projection, just a little bit old, some of the ones that are listed here as under construction would be complete. But here, if we take a look, carriers in the world, US 11, China 2, Italy 2, although China is trying to build more, UK 1, Russia 1, India 1, France 1, Thailand 1. So if we pretty much add up all the other aircraft carriers, US has more aircraft carriers than pretty much everyone else combined. Now the US doesn't usually have them necessarily all at sea. There may be 7 at sea, 6 or 7 at sea at any given point in time. But in terms of the ability, if you think about it, so the US often has them stationed, different ones that are at sea at different points in the world. So in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, in the Persian Gulf, depending on where there's need, but there's certain ones that are placed at different kind of potential hotspots around the world. There's carrier battle groups that are kind of stationed in those areas that are ready to support any activity. So if we talk about kind of, yes, it's still far from the US homeland, but they've got almost a floating base close to any of the different hotspots, a defensible floating base, which decreases the significance of the loss of strength gradient. All right, let's move on to Air Force. So planes and helicopters, missions include strategic bombing. So that's bombing runs where the planes come and drop bombs on military or civilian or industrial targets. Close air support, so that's when planes or helicopters come in to support troops on the ground. So troops are facing strong attack, and planes or helicopters come in, launch fire munitions at the enemy forces to soften them and support the ground troops who are under attack. Interception, so think planes fighting planes or preventing planes. So for example, Canadian Air Force, one mission that it'll often participate in is if Russian fighters, bombers, intelligence aircraft stray too close to North American territory, Canadian or American fighters would be deployed to intercept and escort from our airspace or the American airspace the Russian jets. And if they won't turn back, then it could come into conflict. reconnaissance, so gathering information, gathering intelligence on others, so taking pictures of the ground, seeing what's happening on the ground, even signals intelligence too, in terms of listening to electronic, so listening to communications on the ground, and then transport. So bringing either small scale in terms of helicopters, say transporting troops from the base to kind of the front and back. So rather than walking or going in armored person air carriers, flying in helicopters, but also in terms of moving, say, troops from home to the conflict zone. So moving, say, when Canada was in Afghanistan, moving Canadian from Canada, Canadian forces from Canada to Afghanistan, right? In terms of larger transport planes, or moving equipment there. So moving military equipment there could be in terms of transport. And then in many countries, missile forces are also placed under the control of the Air Force. So ballistic missiles, nuclear missiles are often under control of the Air Force. So, and now turning to weapons of mass destruction. So there's three primary categories of weapons of mass destruction. So we have nuclear weapons divided into fusion and fission bombs. It's not important for our purposes, the difference between fusion and fission bombs. They cause large explosions, so very large explosions, and usually measure in terms of tons of TNT, so the equivalent of, say, say a 1 kiloton bomb would be equivalent to 1,000 tons of TNT. And then, but also what's significant and unique to nuclear weapons is not just the explosive size, but the release of radiation. And we'll get a little bit more into nuclear weapons, but first, chemical weapons. So they release chemicals that disable and kill people. Chemicals might be lethal, such as nerve gas, or merely irritating, such as tear gas. Chemicals can interfere with the nervous system, blood, breathing, or other bodily functions. Some can be absorbed through the skin, others must be inhaled. So there's a variety of different chemical weapons, but they're different chemical compounds that have some effect on the body. Probably the most commonly seen would be things like tear gas, which is a chemical irritant. It doesn't generally kill you. It just, it's very, very irritating and doesn't make you want to continue fighting or continue being where you are if exposed to tear gas. And then the more severe would be ones that can kill you very quickly and not terribly pleasantly. Things like nerve agents, which interfere with the nervous system, with the brain and the spine and the nerves, and are lethal. And then finally, biological weapons. So resemble chemical ones in many ways, except that instead of chemicals, they use microorganisms or biologically derived toxins. So the weapons are biological in nature. Some use viruses or bacteria that cause fatal diseases such as smallpox, bubonic plague, and anthrax. Others cause non-fatal but incapacitating diseases, or diseases that kill livestock, right? So you could have diseases that kill the people who are exposed that merely just incapacitate them and remove, like they're sick enough that they're not going to die, but they can't really be fighting at this point. Or biological weapons have been designed that also kill livestock within an area to kind of disrupt the food supply. We hear the most about nuclear weapons because of their destructiveness. Many more countries actually have chemical and biological weapons than have nuclear. They're not often used. In all cases, there are conventions kind of against using them, given their destructiveness. We're going to focus mainly because of their importance to, they've played a greater kind of role in the pattern of international politics and arguably in the Cold War in maintaining the peace. So we're going to focus mostly on nuclear weapons. So how are nuclear weapons delivered? So if you've got a bomb, you need to have some way of being able to get it into, kind of deliver it to your target. The having a strong nuclear presence and one that can be protected against attack is based on having a nuclear triad. So the strongest nuclear powers in order to be able to protect their nuclear weapons to make sure nobody could get rid of them and then you lose the impact, will split them between bombers, missiles, so ICBMs being intercontinental ballistic missiles, and then submarines, submarine launched ballistic missiles. So if you have some that as soon as there's any threat, they, bombers take off and fly with the missiles, harder to shoot down, missiles kind of on the ground, and then missiles that can be delivered from anywhere in the ocean. You've got a much more difficult, it's much more difficult to hunt down and destroy all of the different delivery systems. So here, an example of a bomber. This is an American B-2 bomber. I chose a B-2 because it's one of the more interesting looking planes in the world. So this would be a bomber that could deliver nuclear weapons. We've got then here we would have kind of ground-based, delivering ICBMs. So we've got a mobile missile launcher on the left. This was the format favored largely by the Soviet Union. So mobile, less defensible in terms of if you know where they are, they're very easy to destroy, but it's especially if you've got a large territory like the Soviet Union or the US, there's a lot of territory. So if you've got a lot of them spread out, it could be, and they're mobile, it could be very difficult to keep track of where all of them are. And then missile silos, which are kind of silos built into the ground, not movable, but much more difficult to destroy. So much more survivable against an attack because they're buried in the ground. So it's kind of a different logic. The Americans tend to favor the missile silo. The Soviets tended to favor the mobile missile launcher, but both to be delivering ICBMs. And then we've got the submarine launched ballistic missiles. So this is a picture of a top of a ballistic missile submarine. So kind of the different kind of circles or part of what resemble circles or kind of are doors for missile tubes where nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles could be fired out from them. Not all submarines, most submarines aren't missile submarines. Most of them are attack submarines. So submarines are largely divided among the nuclear states between missile submarines and attack submarines. And so this would be a ballistic missile submarine here. So why were nuclear weapons so important in kind of the Cold War period in the second half of the 20th century? Was based on the concept of structural deterrence theory. So based on the idea that war becomes unlikely when power is balanced and the cost of war is high. So if you've got, if you have both of these two different conditions, war, even if a country wanted war, war becomes very difficult to have. So in the Cold War, bipolarity and nuclear destructiveness, peace was maintained through the balance of terror. So balance of, rather than balance of power, balance of terror. So knowing that with the extent of nuclear destructiveness, any war would be prohibitively costly. Your entire, not just your military, but your entire society could be decimated, could be destroyed. And so if you wanted to think about starting a war, you had to know, even if you were planning to just start a limited war, that this could escalate up to something that would be catastrophic. So parity relations, when coupled with high costs, are especially stable and robust. So mutual deterrence, mutually assured destruction. So deterrence we'll talk more about next time, but deterrence is kind of the threat that if you do something I don't like, I'm going to respond, uh, and you threaten how you're going to respond. So in the nuclear case, it'd be if you attack, or if you take a certain action, we will respond with nuclear weapons and destroy your civilization, essentially. Now, because in the Cold War, both sides had nuclear weapons, they could both threaten the other, saying, if you do this thing I don't like, we'll destroy you. So both sides knew that if any conflict got started, there's a possibility that would escalate to a situation where both sides were firing nuclear weapons at each other. And so conflicts would lead into a situation referred to as mutually assured destruction, where both sides can inflict unacceptable damage on the other. And it's fun that the acronym for mutually assured destruction is MAD. So you kind of were in a situation where both sides knew that there was unacceptable costs to starting war, so the only solution was to not start war. When costs of war are low, so for example, in conventional weapons, war is always possible, even under parity conditions, right? Because the cost, even if you're not sure you're going to win because the other side is very strong, right? Because the costs of war are low, I mean, they still might be very high, but we're not likely talking about the loss of your entire civilization. War is still possible. Now, under parity conditions where both sides are about as strong, they're still less likely. But they're still possible because you could try fighting a limited war. Say you could attack the other one just not even at home. Say you could attack one of their allies, or you could attack them where they're deployed at a different interest, and try to fight a limited war, knowing that the other side's not going to want to escalate into a larger war because they don't know they're going to win. So you could kind of try to fight a limited war. When you're talking about cost of war being so high with nuclear weapons, even starting a limited war, there's always the fear, what if accidents happen and this gets bigger and then bigger and then bigger and we fall into nuclear war? That's not good, right? So the only solution, the only way to avoid that for completely is to just not start any form of war. Don't even fight a limited war. Asymmetric power relations are unstable. Most unstable when costs of war are low, neither can deter, and at least one side sees an advantage in attacking first. Even if one side can deter, war remains possible. So asymmetric power, so you do want to have, in general, you do want to have balance of power, right? So this is parity combined with high costs of war. Now, one side having a deterrent even isn't enough. So say one side has a deterrent, there's nothing to say that it can't exploit that deterrent and attack the other, knowing that because of its deterrent. So say Canada and the US are going to fight each other, and pretend that there isn't just this great imbalance in, actually, let's go with France and Germany, because France has nuclear weapons, Germany does not, right? So if they were to be adversaries, France can deter Germany because it has nuclear weapons. But so that means Germany can't really initiate war with France. It doesn't mean France can initiate war with Germany, right? If anything, it's backed by that. If the war starts turning against it, Germany's limited in what it can do in terms of counterattacking because of the threat of nuclear weapons. So if the absolute cost of war increases, all else being equal, the probability of war decreases. Now, in the Cold War, we are in this situation of extremely high cost of war and not asymmetric power relations, but parity. So balance of power between the two states. And so the argument goes that this was a doubly stable relationship. Because of the balance of power, war was always going to be difficult, right? So structural deterrence theory comes down on the balance of power. So balancing kind of symmetric power relations or balanced power makes war less likely. Parity makes war less likely, combined with also high cost of war making war less likely. When you combine those together, it could be, the argument goes, it could be a very stable relationship. So who are the members of the nuclear club? So we've got the P5, so kind of the original five, those who in the non-proliferation treaty are kind of accepted as nuclear states. Also interestingly, they're the permanent five in the Security Council. So we've got the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. So these are your five original nuclear states, US being the first. Then India and Pakistan both developed nuclear weapons kind of in response to each other. Israel, so I put nuclear opacity in that. Israel, it's the worst kept secret in international relations that Israel has nuclear weapons. They like it this way. They like that it's the worst kept secret because they don't want it to be a secret. Because if it's not a secret, then they want their enemies to know they have nuclear weapons. Because otherwise, if they don't know they have nuclear weapons, they're not useful in terms of being able to threaten unacceptable punishment, in terms of being able to deter the other one. So not useful in that sense. But they also don't want to be too open about it, right? That's why they still want it to be the best kept secret, but still kind of a secret, or at least not official. Because if it's official, then their adversaries may want to develop nuclear weapons of their own, or could come out and say, well, Israel has it, so we should have it. But now if the adversaries come out and say, oh, we want to have it, because it's not official, Israel has it, then it looks like they're being more provocative, right? So Israel actually really likes this nuclear opacity stance. And then finally, North Korea. Has in the last decade developed a small nuclear force. So why do states develop nuclear weapons, right? Because it's a growing number of states, but still in terms of states in the world, it's a small percentage. Now, not all states have the technological capacity where they could, but many states in the world do have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, but haven't. Canada could have nuclear weapons if it decided it wanted to, probably within 6 months. And it's been that case for decades. We just don't choose not to have nuclear weapons. And we've made that choice, and I think it's not a choice that's going to be changing anytime soon. But Canada has the material, has the technological know-how, has the equipment that Canada could very easily develop nuclear weapons if it so desired. It doesn't, and that's true of many other countries. So Sagan developed kind of 3 models as to why states develop nuclear weapons. So we've got a security, domestic politics, and a norms model. So the security model. So this was best summarized by George Shultz. The argument for the security model: proliferation begets proliferation. So every time one state develops nuclear weapons to balance against its main rival, it also creates a nuclear threat to another state in the region, which then has to initiate its nuclear weapon programs to maintain its national security. So it becomes this giant long chain. So the US developed it, right? And the US at first, like there's many states who were kind of looking at the possibility in the Second World War context. The US got there first, right? So the US gets there, and then so who feels that they need to get there? Well, the Soviets feel like they need to get there because their main adversary has it, right? And then so you've got, you know, the UK and France, who are adversaries to the Soviets, feel like they need to get there. And then China, you know, also feels like they need to get there because they're somewhat adversaries to the US as well. So China feels the response. So we've got chains. Then you could even put India, because India and Pakistan got it at the same time, but India's not particularly comfortable. You know, India and China have had problems, right? So if India starts a little bit with, well, they'd like to have it against Pakistan, but also, you know, in response to China. But as soon as India starts developing, well, Pakistan's feeling nervous and so feels the need to be having nuclear weapons as well. Israel having it, many would point to Iran's nuclear weapons program as being a response to Israel's nuclear weapon program. So essentially, because remember, deterrence, if only one side has a deterrent, right, that side can pretty much do what it would like. So again, returning to our France-Germany one, France can deter Germany from doing anything because it's got nuclear weapons, but Germany can't deter France from doing what it wants. Germany can't threaten unacceptable punishment on France, right? So if France can act as belligerent as it wants or as aggressive it wants, knowing that Germany can't really threaten unacceptable damage on France. It could threaten war, but war would be costly to both sides. But it can't, and even if it threatens war, it's limited in what it could do, because France could say, if you cross this line, if France starts losing the war, it says, Germany, if you cross this line, we're going to use nuclear weapons. So France could be as aggressive as it wants. Germany's got to be more restrained. So there's certain, so both sides would prefer to have, it's more stable. So as soon as kind of your adversary gets it, you need to respond so that you can mutually deter, right? So if Germany and France both have it, then they can both threaten each other, saying, if you do this thing we don't want, like if you're too aggressive, if you attack us, we'll respond with nuclear weapons. Both sides could say it to each other, and so both sides are restrained in acting aggressively. So it's more stable. So it makes sense from a security perspective that if your adversary is developing nuclear weapons, that you'd want to be as well. Otherwise, you could be exploited using them. You could be compelled to using them. Domestic politics would be the second model. So it focuses on domestic actors who encourage or discourage governments from pursuing the bomb. Whether or not the acquisition of nuclear weapons serves the national interest of the state, it's likely to serve the parochial, bureaucratic, or political interest of at least some individual actors within the state, right? So again, remember when we talked about the different foreign policy models, right? And now the rational actor model said kind of everyone's looking out for the self-interest, right? But then we also saw that kind of bureaucracies, or like kind of the leaders of different bureaucracies are also looking at it in terms of what's going to get the most resources to their organization, right? And then they're engaged in a bargaining, in any situation, engaged in a bargaining match against different potential stakeholders, and it's based on kind of the power of different organizations as to who's going to win. So think about if there's a discussion going on in terms of should a state develop nuclear weapons. So certain organizations are going to look at it, and if you look at kind of nuclear scientists, right? Well, they get more jobs and more funding if there's a nuclear weapons program. Air forces, oftentimes nuclear weapons are placed under the control of air forces, right? So Air Force generals are probably, particularly those in the missile program, are going to be supportive of nuclear weapons. Anybody in industries that would be developing nuclear weapons may be supportive. So all of these different ones are probably going to go into, when on this nuclear issue, go into an alliance in terms of pushing for nuclear weapons programs. Who are some who may oppose it? Different branches of the military who aren't going to have control over the nuclear weapons program, right? There's a limited amount of money that can go towards the military. If more is going to the Air Force for the nuclear weapons program, that means less is going to the other branches of the military. Weapons providers who build weapons, but not nuclear weapons, they may be opposed. Anti-nuclear groups are likely to be opposed. So you've got kind of different alliances on this question, and none of these, again, we're necessarily thinking in terms of these positions, we're necessarily thinking about the national interest. We were talking about kind of their own individual and organization's self-interest. And then finally, the norms model. So third focus on norms concerning weapons acquisition, seeing nuclear decisions as serving important symbolic functions, both shaping and reflecting a state's identity. So depending on your identity as a state, there's certain actions that you need to be taking, right? There's certain symbols that you need to be presenting that are things kind of that fit your role. So according to this perspective, state behavior is determined not by leaders' cold calculations about national security interests or parochial bureaucratic interests, but rather by deeper norms and shared beliefs about what actions are legitimate and appropriate in international relations. So say you're somebody who, a country that believes that your country is a great power, right? And as symbol of a great power that's kind of recognized in the international system is having nuclear weapons. So if you believe that you're a great power, then kind of appropriate behavior in that role may be viewed as developing nuclear weapons. So you may start a nuclear weapons program because this is somebody in what in your identified role should be doing, right? It's an appropriate symbol of your status of your role. If you're a non-great power, right, there's also a norm of non-proliferation that exists, right, of not spreading nuclear weapons. There's a fairly strong norm against spreading nuclear weapons. So if you're a non-great power, doesn't have the need and doesn't have necessarily the status concerns about showing that you've got this symbol of great power capabilities, well then, even if you were thinking about, even if there's a strong lobbying effort from the nuclear industry of, oh, we'd like to have nuclear weapons, it doesn't seem, so from Canada's perspective, right, developing nuclear weapons wouldn't seem like an appropriate thing to do for a country in Canada's position, right? We're protected under the American nuclear umbrella. We don't really have the enemies where nuclear deterrence would be needed. We've signed on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Canada's got this kind of not only as kind of a middle power, but kind of projects itself as like an international kind of good guy or peaceful state. That wouldn't really fit our image that we try to project in terms of peacefulness. So all of those together would make that, from just kind of a normative standpoint, developing nuclear weapons wouldn't really fit who we are. It wouldn't fit the image we're projecting internationally. It wouldn't be a symbol that would really be congruent with who we see as ourselves, and it just wouldn't feel, as Canadians, it probably just wouldn't feel appropriate. Like this is not supposed to be the thing that a country like Canada does. So that's all for today. So next time we'll continue on kind of use of the force, so kind of power and what are the different kind of how can military exert certain power. So have a great rest of your day.